it's a rarity among commission colleagues to be. Okay.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this event. I think the topic of the event is a really interesting and important topic, which is why it was not too difficult to get all these people of the panel on board, and it's really all the relevant people for having a very interesting discussion that we could bring on board on this panel. I think that also explains why, despite the early hour, we still have a lot of people participating and because of the nice weather. So thanks a lot for coming, but I think I can promise you a very interesting event. So the topic of protecting EU firms without protectionism is a topic that really crosses different policy angles here. So it has to do with trade policy, it has to do with industrial policy, has to do with competition policy. So it's really a very challenging topic here. But nevertheless, I think it's a very important and pressing topic in view of the changes in the global landscape that we are seeing here. So before we go into the panel, I would like to give a very short introduction, which is basically an introduction showing you a number of statistics that set the scene. I think in this world of alternative facts, I think it's important to have an evidence-based discussion, particularly in these kind of issues here. I'm going to go very quickly through the slides here because some of you will probably know all these statistics here, definitely the panel members, and they will also be available on the website. So the details, we're not going to go into too much in the details that you can always find in the slides on the website afterwards here. So just to start off, a bit of figures on how the global landscape is actually changing and what position the EU is taking in these. First of all, in terms of GDP growth, that's of course an important one. So here we see that since the crisis, the US has recovered a bit earlier than the EU, but now also the EU is well recovered. But of course, the big elephant is in the room is China here, with still massive real GDP growth rate and basically not much sensitivity of the crisis here. If we go then a bit more in the details of where this growth of GDP is actually coming from, the value-added growth here, and we look at a very important part of that, which is high-tech manufacturing and value-added creation in high-tech manufacturing. High-tech meaning basically the digital sector as well as pharmaceuticals. So those are the major important high-tech manufacturing sectors. So there you see that the United States still is a very important player in creating high-tech manufacturing value-added. But of course, the line that rises, if you don't see it, that's the Chinese one, and Europe is actually it's a bit stable here and coming in second place here, but has been completely outpaced by China as well. If we then look into the trade, the product, the high-tech product trade balance. So there you see that for the US, it's a negative trade balance, very persistent negative trade balance. Explains also quite a lot of sensitive issues from the US side. For Europe, actually a bit of good news, where we recently have actually improved our trade balance in high-tech products. But again, you see that the surpluses in high-tech products come from Asian countries here, and again, the rise of China clear. So that's high-tech, which definitely matters quite a lot for our growth potential. If you look at medium high-tech, and there you have also for Europe very important sectors. You have the car manufacturing, which is a very important sector for Europe. You also have the chemical sector and the electric and electronic equipment. So these are really very hardcore sectors for the EU economy. So you see overall that indeed the EU used to be the major producer of value added in those sectors here. It's pretty stable. It didn't really lose overall size, but it also here has been overtaken by China. And if we take a look at the product trade balance in medium and high-tech products, there you see that the EU has a positive trade balance in that, so that's still very positive news, and was able to actually maintain its position here. China has increased also its trade balance here, but still the EU dominates here. And this is a sector where the United States definitely also continues to lose its position here. So the EU and the US have a somewhat different position in these different types. And then one very important sector for Europe is the car manufacturing sector here. So there you see that the EU is on top, is still a large one, but very recently actually was also surpassed by Europe here, and that's a sector where the US had a very big drop here, has managed to recover a bit, but it's still much less smaller, and so the rise of China in car manufacturing is definitely also important. Now, and if you then look at exports and imports in car manufacturing, so what you see here is that China it's rising, but it's exporting mostly to other Asians, so it's not so much exporting to the EU. If you look at the EU, where they're exporting for them, also China is an important part of export for car manufacturing. And if you look at China from the Chinese perspective, where they're importing cars from, the EU is a very important source for imports here. So the EU, so for the moment in cars, the EU is still exporting quite a lot to China here, and it's not importing a lot from China here. So the trade balance there is still positive, but of course can change very drastically with the new challenges in the car manufacturing with respect to electric cars here. Now what this just identifies is where most of the value added is created in which countries, but of course a lot of that value added created in other countries also comes from multinationals, foreign direct investment. So the Chinese rise is also to a large extent built on the value added created by foreign companies here. It's still a very important and growing destination for foreign direct investment inflows here, but also increasingly is an important source for FDI outflow, where a number of Chinese companies are becoming sufficiently important also as investors abroad here. Then I would like to also show you some statistics in terms of innovation. It's my research area, but I think it's also a very important driver for how we will evolve in future in terms of our positions in global markets based on our innovative power now. If you look at the global R&D landscape, so the most recent number that's really comparable across the world for 2015 shows that Europe in the middle is about 1/5 of all the R&D expenditures are located in Europe. North America is somewhat bigger, with of course still the importance of the US. But you see East and Southeast Asia is already 37% of all the R&D expenditures go into that area here. That's of course Japan. It's also Korea, but also increasingly China. So the rise of China in terms of innovation power is definitely a very important phenomenon. So here you see the R&D to GDP spending. So you see that Japan is relative to GDP. So Japan is still very important. The rise of Korea is also very important. The other rising star is China. So if you see the one that's rising, that's China. And if you look at the EU, that has been really pretty flat and lower than definitely the Asian countries, but also the US, and very stable. So it's only very gradually increasing here, and it's actually now recently also been passed by China. So in terms of our innovation expenditures relative to the rising star of China, we are not catching up fast enough here. The rise of China is not only in terms of R&D expenditures, it's also, if you go back one step more, and look at the scientific publications, so there also you see the rise of China. The left side you see just in terms of overall number of publications, so it's actually has actually now been actually has overtaken the US in terms of the size of scientific publications. The EU is still larger if you count the EU as a total, and as long as we have the UK in, we're still on top here. If you look at the top 1%, so that's really the high quality type of publications, so there the rise of China is still much more limited, but it's also rising there. So it's not just in terms of improving in terms of quantity, it's also really at the frontier of scientific publications, making important inroads here. And some positive note here too. Okay. That's my own time. We do see that the EU is actually is doing not too badly at the top and holding better position than the US here. Also related to the increase of China in terms of scientific power is its training of, and particularly STEM profiles here. So here we have the natural sciences and engineering degrees, bachelors as well as PhDs here, and so it's massively also investing in training these people here, and that's the workforce for innovation in their industry here. We also see increasingly that that private firms, Chinese firms, are entering the league of large corporate R&D spending firms. So this is also some own calculations that we did on the basis of the scoreboard of large firms. And there you see the rise of China here. That's particularly also companies like Huawei, Tencent, who are really entering the league of largest corporate spenders here. And that's particularly in digital that you see really also at the top the rise of Chinese firms. So here you see the share in these scoreboard firms that are the largest R&D spenders, and particularly at the top in their sector, so the top 10% here. You see the US is definitely very much present in the top in each of the sectors in terms of R&D spending. Europe is somewhat smaller here, but all of the existing players, US and Europe, are losing position at the top, and this is because China is the rising star also at the top in terms of corporate R&D spending here. That's most pronounced in digital, but not exclusively here too. Yeah, so this was digital and here. Some fun statistics, and then I can close this. If you look at the supercomputers, where are they located? So here you see also, and this is the top 500 biggest supercomputers. So you see clearly the rise of China there too, the US, and the EU still very slow in catching up. And then finally, something that also receives a lot of attention is artificial intelligence. Well, if you look at artificial intelligence, it seems to be really a strategic sector of attention in the EU, but also in the US and other countries. If you take a look at who's active in artificial intelligence in terms of looking at the patents, you see it's mostly Asia, also the US. Europe has actually lost quite a lot of position in artificial intelligence, and China is massively also increasing its position in this hot area here. So here you see again how Japan, Korea, US, Taiwan and China, and then on another smaller scale, you see where Europe is. And on top of that, it's really, Europe is still very much divided in the various countries here. It's not really a united EU in terms of artificial intelligence. So this is just a number of statistics which I think was important to put on the table here, just to show you the sense of urgency and the big shifts that are occurring in this area here. But then, of course, the big questions that these kind of numbers arises. So what's the implication for Europe? Can we trust our European companies to be fit enough for this changing global landscape? And of course also, will European citizens be beneficiaries of this changing global landscape here? And are our policies fit for dealing with these changing global landscapes and the different types of policies, trade policy, competition policy, industrial policy, innovation policy? So many different and complex issues. And when the panel will have finished, we will have solved all these issues here. So this also explains a bit, I think, the type of panel that we have here. So we will first start with two perspectives from member states which have been very active in dealing with these issues of how to prepare your companies and your citizens for these changes in the global scene here. So we have, on the one hand, we have Foucault Vezelaar, who is from the Netherlands. He is currently the chief economist in the Ministry of Economic Affairs here, but he also used to be in the international trade or international affairs department here. So he really combines the trade and the competition policy issues here. He has been working actively on this issue. He also has publications on this, which will be put on our website as well. And then we will move to Vincent Assilou, who is from France, definitely also a country for which these issues are very sensitive and very high on the policy agenda here. Vincent has also worked extensively on these issues here as a director of economic and finance in France Stratégie, which is a bit the internal think tank to the Prime Minister, I can say, right. So I would like to start the discussion with giving the word to them, and then I will move to the other parts of the panel here. So, Foucault, can you start, or Vincent?
Well, thank you. Thank you for organizing this this seminar and giving me the possibility to put on the table the Dutch perspective. First of all, I want to say that I'm very pleased to see that there are 3 DGs here represented from the Commission. As you put in your introducing slides, there is a case to be made that we should look at this as an integrated policy area involving trade, competition, industrial policy, innovation policies. So I think it's both topical but also very well organized. Thank you for that. But to start off with the Dutch perspective, it's only logical to say that trade and openness to trade and investment, that's part of the DNA for the Netherlands. We know as a small open economy that our welfare is coming and prospers is coming from opening up to the outside world. For the Netherlands, we are more than 30% of our gross domestic income with trade. And also this consumers benefit quite a lot from the competitive environment it creates. There is recent research by Feikobaum and Kandelwel that showed that international trade leads to lower prices, to an increase in purchasing power parity of Dutch consumers in terms of tens of percentages of points, which is very large and taken over a long time period, obviously. But it shows that there is certainly a case to be made to be open and to be as open as possible, at least for the Dutch consumers. It also pays out at the macro level, I would say, if you look at the Netherlands and the Netherlands economy, according to the World Economic Forum, the Dutch economy is the most competitive of the European Union and number 4 of the world. So it shows that openness also brings in competitiveness and fosters competitiveness of an economy. That is, even in today's rapidly changing global landscape, as was shown just a minute ago, we believe that openness is then also key for Europe, key to Europe's competitiveness on global markets. We are still the largest economy and trading bloc worldwide, and Europe's strength is in its competitive business environment. Foreign-owned companies are important for the European economy. It means that they contribute significantly to productivity and R&D expenses in Europe. So to be open is only a good idea, I would say. That's also to say that there is no interest in creating fences around the European economy. By contrast, it's important for long-term growth to continue to foster the investment climate in Europe. That's the policy approach we take in the Netherlands, and that's the policy approach we will take for Europe as a whole. Having said that, that does not imply that there is a laissez-faire approach. It is not a time to sit back and relax. The European industry is dealing with increasing global competition. And we have to respond to that. And at the same time, there are large societal challenges and there are large changing driving forces in the economy, such as digitization and the climate change. So my answer to these challenges would be we have to prepare our businesses for that and not protect the businesses. European action is needed in this area, and to take some examples, we should reset priorities within the multi-annual framework. I will not go into detail on the proposals by the European Commission just set out yesterday, but less than 10% of the EU budget is currently spent on research and development and innovation, and that's not very much compared to the value added it generates. We should also bring more focus in the large number of EU funds and instruments to encourage European businesses and institutions to jointly do research and innovate in areas of future importance. And by that I mean the key enabling technologies and also the societal challenges such as climate change. These are issues that are too large to be tackled on only a nation-state level. We should really work at the European level here together. And that also implies that we should streamline priorities across national industry and innovation strategies. Instead of having soon 27 different strategies, I think the Commission could be of great help to coordinate Member States' efforts. And we will be open to that, to be sure. There are also some initiatives, recent initiatives by the Commission, which in my view are a bit too defensive. To take the investment of the investment screening proposal, well, screening in vital sectors, yes, that's important, that's what we should do, but we should be wary not to extend that too much. Vital sectors are currently in the threat of being extended to all kinds of economic and strategically economic sectors. What that means lies a bit in the eye of the beholder, which makes it, at least from my point of view, a risky business, and that we enter into a protective or protectionist environment. So rather than going into this area, we need to stay with current definitions of vital sectors and be more offensive with regard to the business environment to foster the strategic economic sectors. What we still see lacking a bit is the issue of reciprocity. We think that reciprocity should be part of the open market economy narrative. By that I mean the European Union is readily accessible to foreign direct investment, and as I argued, that we should remain so. But at the same time, it's hard to explain that European firms encounter limited market access in other countries around the world. So that's certainly an issue that should be taken up. It should be a focus in the investment agreements and the negotiation. And we believe that the dialogue with China is a good first step in that direction and should be taken further with an eye to opening up also markets abroad. Moreover, in my view, it's also strange that European companies face at the same time an uneven level playing field at the European market. To be more specific, unlike European companies, firms from third countries can enter the European market with state aid, which implies that there is an unlevel playing field. I think that the European policy should focus more on improving the level playing field, and we could look into the possibilities to apply the regulatory framework within the European Union to tackle state aid in companies more broadly, so as to have a market-oriented internal market and also with players from abroad. I know this is currently not at the table, but I think it could be an interesting direction to exploit. I also realize that that tackling these issues will require some patience. Patience some of us will not have, but in the end we have mutual interests. This is also true for our trading partners. The influence of countries like China and India is growing on the world stage. This is unavoidable. It's only logical if you look at the size of the countries involved. It's nothing that we should be afraid of as such. It's a chance, I would say. And in the end, going into a multilateral and bilateral framework will very much help us and also these other countries to benefit from reciprocal market access. And this is, I think, that what we should keep in mind. Thank you for your attention. Hopefully I stayed within my time limits.
Yes, and I take it so, being from the Netherlands, sorry. See, you were on time. Being for the Netherlands, I think it also is very to be expected that you have also much more openness for open, yeah. Remaining open for given a small open economy that you traditionally have been. So I'd like to now give the floor to a larger economy like France. Is it the same kind of support for openness even for a large country like France?
Well, to the risk of disappointing you, I think pretty much agree with all what was said before, and actually I think openness is key in our ability to promote growth and jobs. And basically, I wouldn't say France is a big economy, it's a large economy. If you look at the global economy today, we are a medium-sized country, and of course, like actually all other economies in the world, being open is absolutely key to our prosperity. In that respect, I think when coming to the question, shall we protect our companies, the key is actually for them to be exposed to international competition. We know very well from the statistics you showed, and also from the work of the OECD and others, that accessing cheap inputs, it's absolutely key in our ability to compete globally. 25%, around 25% of French exports are actually made of imported inputs. So it's absolutely key for these inputs to be cheap in order to for the exports to absolutely to remain competitive, basically. So on that, I mean, there is no disagreement at all on this point, and to the contrary, I believe it's very important, and I believe for my country, it would be absolutely key to make some progress in terms of and reforms in terms of capacity to basically facilitate trade. We have some issues with our port infrastructures, for example. Some of them are really at the sort of the top of the league, like Le Havre, for example. But others need to make some progress, and that's very important, as I said, to get access to the cheap inputs. So this is an ongoing sort of agenda for reform. Well, actually, you showed some statistics, and basically Europe is doing well in terms of trade. We have a trade surplus, it's huge. We are not basically losing that much ground, whereas at the same time, of course, we have a new big player in the room, China. But what do we expect? I mean, we have 1.3 billion people getting integrated in the global economy. So yes, indeed, they should gain some market share. And actually, okay, there are some problems, but it's not a one-way trade. China is also importing a lot and boosting that way growth of countries which are at the same time importing from Europe. So it's a sort of a win-win, as we know. And actually, what we should hope is for India and Africa to sustain the sort of 4 decades growth that we have seen experience in China, probably in a different way, probably not that much export-led growth, but definitely that would be the best news for basically fairness and growth at a global scale. Of course, we will have to tackle issues that would create in terms of climate change and biodiversity, but that is in any way our responsibility. And basically, as the most advanced economies in the world, we have to basically tackle that issue head on. So trade is probably not the main culprit. To the contrary, trade is indeed one of the main engine of growth, and it should remain so. But what worries me more is the fact that Europe is losing ground in basically the new technology sectors. All sectors are going to be disrupted. What we have experienced in the digital economy, where basically Europe is almost absent from the picture, where 95% of the main players are not European, where basically when we have 15 unicorns in Europe, there are 90 in the US and 30 in Asia. That worries me. And what should we do? Why are we there? Given that, as Foucault said it, we are now experiencing the artificial intelligence, the autonomous vehicles revolution, the biotechnology. Are we going to lose this industrial revolution as well, as we have experienced in the digital world? No, we should not, and we need to basically tackle head-on at least 3 issues. First, single market. We should not think that the single market, in the single market, the work is done already. We have basically, if we measure the intensity of trade between 2 member states by comparison to the intensity of trade between 2 US states, correcting for language differences, distance, GDP, we are still 4 times below. So 2 US states trade 4 times more than 2 member states. We basically reduced that difference by half thanks to the policy of the single market over the last 30 years. And we should basically give ourselves the challenge to basically reduce again by half this gap between the intensity of trade between Europe and the US. Why? Because if we have not one of the global leaders in the digital economy, it is in part, and probably very importantly, due to the fact that our startups have tremendous difficulties to basically scale up on the European scale. When they grow in their domestic market, and usually they go to the US because then they have access to a bigger market very easily. It's actually very difficult for a small company to enter 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 and more member states market. So that's one of the key, and actually maybe in the discussion we could say a word on how to make progress in that area. That should probably not in the same way we have done so far. We need to be to invent new ways, but there are ways to do that. The second avenue, which is absolutely key for Europe prosperity, is investing in basically financing the most innovative companies. This is, I mean, private and public finances, but mainly private financing. When we compare venture capital in Europe and in the US, this is 4 times less in Europe. And this is, we're not talking about huge amount of money. but we're talking about key amount of money to finance the key players and to scale up the startups. I will, of course, mention, but briefly, the fact that we also need to increase the public investment in R&D, as I was said, and but not in order to just not to be too long. I'll finish on one final point. We should use basically our ability, the single market capacity to regulate for new sectors. So the sort of smart regulation. Let me give an example. If we were to decide now that by 2040, all vehicles sold in Europe should be zero emission, the credibility of EU rule now will basically foster investment by all our companies, car companies and others, to develop the clean vehicle. We are losing out in that industry right now. If we're not catching up soon, one of the key assets, one of the key sectors where Europe is still at the forefront on the global stage will be basically lost. So it is now that we need to act on that.
Thank you, Vincent. So good to hear that also for France, openness is given. So I think you also made a very important point in the sense that trade policy may not be the most pivotal. There we should all align on openness, but that the major battleground will be actually the innovation game here, where you indeed identify the importance in terms of policy for making sure we have a single market for stimulating innovation and also investment, public investment here. So I think this really addresses the three policy areas at the EU level that we have here. So it's the trade policy agenda, but it's also the competition and state aid agenda, and then the industrial growth policy as well here. So it was a very nice introduction to this side of the panel here, in random order, but maybe from left to right. So we first start with Gert-Jan Koopman. He's Deputy Director General in DG Comp, responsible for state aid, but also previously when he was in DG ECFIN as well as in DG Enterprise, worked a lot on industrial policy and economic reforms here. So he's definitely very well placed to address the issue of public financing, but as well in terms of how that can help to direct towards new sectors as well. Yes, you will have to use this one.
Well, thank you, Reinhilde. Thank you to Bruegel for organizing this very stimulating debate. I had expected, frankly, for there to be more food for debate, because I've heard very little about protectionism so far. I'm a little bit disappointed. There we are. So let me very briefly make 3 points. And the first point is that indeed the different policy strands fit together and should be looked at from an integrated perspective. I mean, that was very much the message from the right-hand side of the table, seen from where I sit. And I think this is indeed what the Commission has been advocating as a general strategic approach. So, you know, we are the world's biggest internal market. This is, as everyone agrees, probably the greatest economic strength the Union is affording. It is underwritten by single market rules and by competition policy, and the competition policy of the Union is the most advanced. It covers areas that are not covered elsewhere, state aid control. And I think this is a very good illustration of the point Foucault and Vincent were making, namely that challenging enterprises through competition and openness actually delivers productivity growth. And there is a very extensive literature obviously demonstrating just how important market pressures are for productivity growth and ultimately for wealth. So that is our model, but the model is not naive. Because obviously there are market failures, which is why we do need to have an ambitious innovation agenda, which the Union has, which consists not just of trying to set standards, but also focusing through smart industrial policies on areas where the information asymmetries and, frankly speaking, scale are of such scale challenges are of such a nature that public intervention is warranted. I think Paolo will no doubt say much more about this, but the Union has an industrial and an innovation policy, and it also has financing means. Yesterday, the Commission has proposed a very significant increase from, admittedly, a low level, but a very significant increase in those financial means. So that's a second very important building block next to the internal market and competition rules. And then thirdly, externally, of course, we need to ensure that the openness which we have is replicated, reciprocated, to pick up on a term used on the right-hand side, by other players, so that we can share the benefits of openness more globally. And we do this through a system that ideally relies as much as possible on common rules, so that the level playing field is achieved as much as possible. Now, we live in the real world, whilst in Europe, of course, we have far-reaching powers. We don't have those powers internationally, so it is more challenging to achieve a level playing field externally, but that doesn't stop us from trying, and I'm sure that Thomas will say much more about it from a trade perspective. So I think this integration of policy strands, the European model, if you will, is very important, and as has been recalled, we're actually quite successful. We clearly have challenges, but we are very successful. And I'm very happy to echo what Vincent said about the rise of China, which we should see as a positive thing. The fact that our shares in a number of important variables are decreasing is a natural feature of the growth of the world economy. If we have billions of people being integrated and reaching standards of living that start approaching half of the standards of living in Europe, then naturally, inescapably, Europe's shares will come down. But that doesn't mean we are worse off in terms of competitiveness, doesn't mean that we're worse off in terms of standards of living, and in fact we should embrace that. So, now my second point, to go a little bit deeper into competition policy, because I'm of course responsible for that in this panel, to say that the evidence about the importance of competition on productivity growth really is something I would advise all of you to look at very carefully. It is the cheapest policy we have, it's the most effective policy we have, and the evidence about the problems that lacking competition causes for productivity growth is overwhelmingly strong. There's far too little time to go into all the detail, but just to take one little example, the importance of competition for improving management quality, just to take a very practical point, has been looked at in the literature very, very extensively, and it is very telling. It translates into much higher TFP, and therefore I think this basic starting point should be kept in mind by all of us. On state aid control, very good illustration, I think, is the aviation industry, where failing firms that were propped up by state aid have been forced to exit. And despite all of the difficulties politically that this has engendered, what we have seen is that prices have come down, new entrants have entered the market, and that consumers have been better off. I can give you 3 or 4 examples of national carriers, admittedly smaller ones, that have exited over the past years. But what we now see, if you talk to citizens in the countries concerned, they're very happy because the offers have improved and the prices are much lower and the reliability of the service is much higher. So state aid control is important also from a very classical consumer welfare point of view. It's also important because whilst the principle of prohibition is in the treaty, in fact, we have developed extensive rules that allow aid to be given to address market failures. And of course, we have frameworks for RD&I support, innovation support, that allow aid to flow in very significant volumes, but also in a way that maximizes the return for society by internalizing the spillovers, by ensuring that the benefits are not just kept by the company investing, but are shared as widely as possible without undermining the incentive to innovate. So I think our state aid rules are something in this area to be proud of. They allow investment in innovation, but they do it in a way that avoids what we see in the US, where a company like Amazon is shopping around to establish a headquarters in a state, and where states are out competing each other with subsidies that, frankly speaking, are a complete deadweight loss for the economy of the United States. And I'm not even talking about those states that are offering to rebaptize some of their towns to call them Amazon. We wouldn't do that in Europe. So state aid control helps competition. It allows investment where it is needed in innovation and other important common interest objectives. Now, final point, state aid control is limited by the treaty to controlling aid given by member states. That is what is in 107. I think Vincent has put, Focko has put an interesting idea on the table. He said, well, state aid control should also be addressed to looking at aid given by third countries. Legally, that is of course not possible under the treaty. So if one wanted to explore that, one would have to create a regulatory framework that would empower the Commission to control such aids. That would, I think, trigger, it would require a very careful assessment of what it is exactly that should be controlled, how that relates to trade policy. We're probably, in that case, looking at investments in Europe in companies that operate in the internal market. It would require far-reaching powers of investigation, which the Commission doesn't have in third countries under state aid rules. So I'm not reacting negatively, but I'm flagging that this is something which is not a walk in the park. It's not straightforward at all. And obviously, we have a number of existing instruments which already allow to address some of the underlying concerns, which I believe could possibly be pushed further, could be given more weight. To give you two examples, the Commission has recently opened a dialogue with China underwritten by a Memorandum of Understanding on collaboration on state aid control. Now, that's a small step. Of course, it doesn't translate immediately into big improvements, but it exists. It has the benefit of existing. Secondly, within the context of trade and investment negotiations, of course, there are always chapters on subsidies. It is ultimately a matter of weighing up the respective offensive and defensive interests of member states, and you will not be surprised to hear me say, as a representative of DG Competition, that I would like to see more weight being given to these issues. But at the end of the day, often member states consider that this is, in the wider scale of things, not the top priority. So what I'm trying to say is we have tools to ensure a level playing field. It's a critically important issue, obviously. There are interesting ideas which are being floated here, which I think would require very careful assessment before they're taken forward. But in a debate at Bruegel, it is obviously extremely stimulating to kick those ideas around. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you very much, Gert-Jan. So basically what you're saying is we do have all the instruments in place. We have the different policy areas and they are integrating or integrated. But then on the other hand, the example that we were discussing now, like the component of state aid and how that could be extended to third countries, that's exactly an example of where integration of trade policy and competition policy would really play out very importantly. So the question is, how far can we bring that kind of integration in concrete projects to life? So that's why, Thomas, maybe that's the challenge for you. So apparently the classic trade policy agenda, that's no issue anymore. But how can we also activate trade policy more within the more dynamic innovation industrial policy perspective here, and then therefore the coordination with competition and industrial policy here. Thomas, first I should introduce you, right? So Thomas, you're the head of unit of trade strategy at DG Trade here. He's currently working on Brexit, but that's not an issue we're going to discuss now, unless it's also related to the topic today here. But he has also massive experience in the handling of the EU with WTO, the EU-China relations, TTIP, EU-US. So definitely also this multilateral trade agreements, very important. And he has also recently finished a communication on a balanced and progressive trade policy to harness globalization. So that's particularly the issue that we are discussing here. So he's the right person from trade policy to be addressing the challenge from today.
Thank you for that introduction, Renilde. I'm not going to claim copyright here, but the line "protection without protectionism" is a Commission line. Yeah. We've heard it before from our president, our first vice president, our vice president Katainen, and Commissioner Malmström, as well as others, in two forms. It means that protectionism does not protect, and it means that protection does not equal protectionism. So there is a way to offer protection without sliding into protectionism. Interestingly, you've added the term here, or the subject, EU firms. Because when we talk about protection, we talk about a lot more than just firms. And perhaps we talk more about other things than about firms. And I do want to come back to those other things, including consumers and our society at large, perhaps. But I do appreciate we are zooming in on the question of firms here. Now, looking at trade policy, I would invite you to read some of the recent European Council conclusions or Commission communications. And wherever you find the F word, free trade, you will immediately find in the same sentence another F word, fair trade. We're using consistently now the two things. This is the yin and the yang of our policy, our trade policy, of our EU policy more generally. We need it both. It is about protecting ourselves, but it is also about projecting ourselves. Now, we're very clear, relatively clear, about what free trade means. It means essentially open, rules-based trade. We're far less clear about what fair trade means. And fair trade means many different things to many different people. It used to be very much associated to the political left and to the type of coffee you drank, the bananas you ate, or the chocolate you had. But now it is increasingly hijacked and occupied by the political right. And it means also many things there. But it is not simply about the distinction between left and right. It is also increasingly about the debate on open versus closed. And that is no longer something you can easily associate with either left or right if you look left or right, and mostly to the West, perhaps in the UK and in the US. So it's not just about openness to trade in that sense, it's about openness to ideas, to innovation, to investment, and to people. It's about the model of building borders, or building walls rather, versus or building borders too, versus destroying them. Now, I think the key word has really been used already, and just to show you how key the word is, in trade policy we use the acronym LPF. Leveling the playing field is now the name of the game. It's important that we don't just get the economics right, the economics of openness and the economics of protection, but we also need to get the politics right. And openness sustains only when there are targeted tools to counter challenges. I would also echo, and this is Commission line 2, we are not naive. So it is about a balanced and a progressive trade policy to harness globalization. Now, when we speak about LPF or the level playing field, we're talking, of course, essentially about public footprints on private markets. We're talking about state-sponsored market distortions, even though there are, of course, also predatory practices at company level in the form, for example, of dumping or a downward regulatory pressure and the use of by companies of that race to the bottom, perhaps. So what does the EU do through its trade policy? Of course, we look at it in terms of the different levels, multilateral, bilateral, and our unilateral trade policy. In our multilateral trade policy, the WTO, but not just the WTO, we obviously work towards a rules-based policy, which is a hard nut to crack because we are talking about things which typically have erga omnes implications. You can't simply say, in a bilateral context, I just commit to state aid disciplines for Korea only. I mean, if you do it, you apply it to everyone. And that makes it particularly challenging. It makes it particularly challenging because it assumes you need a critical mass of members around the table to be able to do anything meaningful in this context. Of course, a further challenge in that sense is that solid rules need strong and significant institutions. And it's worth pointing it out, of course, as not just the idea of free trade is under siege these days, the very institutions that support free trade or open rules-based trade, like the World Trade Organization and its dispute settlement body, its appellate body in particular, are being challenged. So the Union has been pushing and continues pushing very much for new rules on subsidies, on countervailing measures. We've done that a long time ago before the level playing field was even a very sexy subject. Things like arm's length financing, dual pricing. We even tried that very much before the Russians joined the organization. in the wake of the financial crisis, which was, of course, challenging to deal with subsidies in relation to some large institutions like financial service suppliers. So we keep pushing that envelope. We keep pushing that envelope in Geneva. We have made recently new proposals in that regard, and we obviously also keep doing that in the bilateral context through disciplines, for example, on state-owned enterprises. Now, that's the bilateral agenda. On the unilateral side, we, of course, also have been sharpening our saw in the form of the trade defense instruments that we have, which we've modernized to ensure the effectiveness of our methodology following the expiry of certain provisions of the Chinese accession protocol to the WTO. And we, of course, have tabled now a proposal that was already mentioned on FDI screening, which follows the same promise, the promise of guaranteeing openness in exchange for allowing, in this case, our member states to seek sufficient guarantees from investors on playing by the rules. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on it. Of course, when we speak about level playing field, we all think and speak mostly about China. Yeah. And that's, of course, very true. I would ask one question, and I will not answer it myself, given that you mentioned Brexit. I would ask the question whether the West is going to be the new East. Because we do have soon a competitor on our doorstep, which, in the minds of some, might become Singapore upon the Thames. A low tax haven, which is going to deregulate certain sectors of the economies, according to some, which might compete with the Union by, now that it has taken back control, some matters like employment and labor policy, or even environmental policy, taxation policy, state aid policy, even though the signals on the last point, at least from the current party, ruling party in London, are not necessarily discouraging. But so the question is, are we going to see a new challenge arising there that requires us to rethink also our instruments and our toolbox in relation to the level playing field, LPF? Now, we often think about trade policy almost exclusively as the subject of international organizations, but far less as an integral part of a broad economic management. One of my favorite lines, which I want to submit here, is that a good trade policy starts at home, which is essentially another way also of saying what my colleagues before me have said, that we do need an integrated approach. The benefits of a liberal trade regime will only be realized in an economy with appropriate macroeconomic policies, efficient labor markets, and a regulatory environment which facilitates mobility of workers, the entry and exit of firms, and of course an education system which enables skills and matches evolving needs. So market opening works best and maybe works at all in a coherent, holistic policy context that facilitates all of these things, the fundamental freedoms, as we like to call them. So placing trade policy in a broader setting is another way of saying that trade policy or trade cannot do it all, despite the fact that our trade strategy is called Trade for All. I often say the subtitle should actually be Trade Cannot Do It All. So we do need the other policy areas to deal with some of these challenges. So if we want leadership abroad, if we want to negotiate successful deals, we need to start at home. We need to get things right, including, for example, what some call the fifth freedom, the free movement of data. Now, two finishing thoughts. Trade policy creates benefits. The benefits of openness have been already mentioned, but it is far less well equipped to deal with what some call, and I still look for a better word, the losers of globalization. Trade policy obviously has distributional consequences, but it actually cannot solve the problems that it creates. And the European Globalization Fund, despite the increase in the funding or trade assistance adjustments, some of the programs that exist they are significant, but they are, of course, only a very partial contribution. So we really need to embed trade policy in a broader policy context. Now, just to finish on the point that we're not just talking about EU firms, we also need to protect consumers. Consumers are increasingly trading. They are also participating in trade, and e-commerce, of course, is a unique, very useful vehicle for them to do so. Now, in the Pascal-Lamy logic, when we talk about firms, we talk about protection. When we talk about consumers, we talk about precaution. Yes, of course, we talk about precaution. We talk about protecting our standards and our values, perhaps. But we also need to go further, and that is what we're doing now in a new digital chapter that we have designed and will pursue in future trade negotiations through some of the provisions on e-commerce, through some of the measures on redress, and we will certainly learn more from the recently adopted consumers package by the Commission. So we need a newer approach also to dealing with consumers, and we do that, of course, in line with this broader idea of trade for all, of delivering the benefits for all. Very last point, of course, in the same logic of protection, we don't only export goods and services, we also export our values and our standards of protection, including environmental protection. This is also a core component of our Trade for All strategy. So as much as this is about projecting ourselves, this is also about protecting ourselves, in particular in the turbulent times that we live in today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that was, again, a very constructive approach to trade policy and how it can help to deal with the challenges here, but also emphasizing it's not only free trade, it's also how to implement a fair trade and how to ensure these strong institutions, how to ensure state-sponsored subsidies, how that's particularly dealt with here, and how to have also the trade defense instruments implementing here. I think then the last area is industrial policy, but I think, Paolo, you have really very easy job here because everybody's helping you to develop an industrial policy for particular areas here, but I'd like perhaps you to focus a bit more on in particular sectors. Does it really work, the instruments and the coordination we have with competition policy as well as trade to really support industrial policy in particular areas that Europe wants to stimulate?
So I'll do my best to add some additional thoughts on top of what my distinguished colleagues already have put on the table, which are very comprehensive thoughts. So although Reinhilde says my role is very easy, it's probably not very easy to say something extra about what the Commission is doing in this respect. I think I would start with a sort of a general reflection. So the obvious or trivial way to answer the question, what should we do about protectionism, is at a very basic level of analysis, well, we do some very good industrial policy. Now, this is a very naive answer because, of course, the question is, what is industrial policy? And there, I think if you ask the same question to each person on this panel and then in the audience, we would all have different answers probably. And the point is that the same measure, like let's say a tariff on steel from the US, can be easily defined as a protectionist measure. On the other hand, the answer to such a policy, so retaliation policy, could be easily defined as industrial policy, right? Depending on the point of view. And to complicate even more this discussion, the thing is that deciding when retaliation is a good thing and when it's a bad thing, it's obviously a very subjective decision, and that sometimes depends on political views or different political economy arguments. So the first suggestion is that I think we should be very careful in using this P word when we discuss policy. So we have to be a bit pragmatic in what we do. And even the vocabulary sometimes is important. Now, it has been said already several times, but I think it's worth repeating. Industrial policy and trade policy and competition policies are indistinguishable. You cannot say you're doing an industrial policy without having a trade policy or without having a competition policy. Now the point is that when redefining the industrial policy at the EU level, we had to be careful to have a sort of a dual approach. On the one hand, I think we all agree, and that's been very clearly transmitted also by my colleagues, industrial policy at the EU level hinges on openness. And that's out of discussion within the EU, and I think it's rightly so. On the other hand, industrial policy, given the political situation in which we're living, needs also to provide a buffer. So we cannot ignore the fact that there will be what economists call exogenous shocks in trade that are independent of our will. And so the EU must be ready to buffer citizens, industry, firms, to cover the consequences of what could potentially happen. And that means two things. Well, first of all, coordination between different areas. It's very good that we have trade and competition here. Ideally, we would also have DG Employment, DG ECFIN, because there are other areas which are absolutely fundamental. To name one, internal demand in the EU is a huge problem. So there's not only trade, there is also internal demand that should be a primary focus. And it's a primary focus of industrial policy, but it's also a primary focus for macroeconomic policy. And that's not only about the usual paradigm of protecting the loser from trade. It's also so it's not only the social pillar, but it's also industrial policy in the sense that firms in the EU cannot really thrive if the internal demand is not strong enough. Now, this said, how to go about it? So, what are we doing in terms of promoting this this industrial policy? The first important thing is that in the communication that was published in January on industrial policy, the European Commission committed to have a very open approach to the definition of industrial policy. That means two things. First of all, the recognition that we cannot do industrial policy without close cooperation with member states. So I'm very happy that we have representative of the Netherlands and France, because the definition of industrial policy needs to be done together with the member states. Second thing, industrial policy needs to be done together with the industry itself. We are not promoting a top-down industrial policy. We want industry to help us in defining what are the priorities. And in this perspective, there should always be two things. In general, we had the industry days that were a very successful event in which more than 1,000 participants attended, and actually had many more demands that we could not actually accept because of the space constraints. In the context of the industry day, we started a high-level roundtable on industry, which was chaired by Vice President Katainen, in which we are asking also firms to give their inputs. And we will meet again in June, and the hope is that together with the industry, we'll set up the priorities for the future industrial policy. The first step of this process, which might sound trivial, but I think is not, is that in cooperation also with the Council, we are working on the definition of a better monitoring tool. So the idea is not to have yet one more set of indicators to follow, but something a bit more comprehensive that will allow a better analysis of economic data, and also a better monitoring of those policy areas that everybody recognizes as fundamental, but on which there is a dramatic lack of data and accurate information. To name one, servitization is very often at the top of the policy discussions, but measuring or monitoring servitization is for economists one of the most challenging things because of the lack of data. So I will close this intervention with the board of geeky suggestion. I'm part of the chief economist team, so maybe I'm a geek by definition. So let me do it. So what is the role of economists in all this? Not only as economists working for the European Commission, so in the policy-making institution, but also in general as a scientific or pseudo-scientific discipline. first of all, if there is a clear message that comes from the current situation, is that politics matter. Even though our economic models have a very clear message on what is good and what is bad, and what the right policy should look like, if there is no political acceptance of these ideas and these models, well, this thing will not simply work. That's very easy. Second thing, and that is very closely related, we'll have to be very careful in designing the reaction at the EU level to whatever sort of exogenous shocks in international politics. And that's for two reasons. First of all, because economic literature suggests very clearly that even uncertainty is extremely problematic for investment and for internationalization of firms. Secondly, because there is also very substantial evidence that trade, so export, is very often a prerequisite or a first step towards investment. So typically the trajectory is that firms first export and then they start investing through FDI. So export is a way in a sort of experimentation phase. Now, this is important because when we want to, if and when we will have to decide on potential retaliation policy for shocks, we'll have to take into account this effect. So it's a call for analysts, economists, not only within the European Commission, but also in think tanks, to take care of these important effects that can be actually very substantial. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much also for reminding us as economists that unfortunately politics matter. I'd like to give the last slot to André, who's our senior fellow here and has been following this topic since years. If you listen to the panel members, we have member states that are all committed to openness and to EU integration of policies. If we listen to the EU policy side, we have all the policy instruments in place. They are integrating. So it seems that we have everything in place. We just have to continue. In view of the challenges ahead of us, do you agree with your more historical perspective? Is it just continuing what we've been doing? Will that be...
Thank you, Renilde. Great to be here and great panel indeed. I heard the same thing as you did, as what you just summarized. That is, I heard a lot of consensus, and the consensus, I would say, I would summarize it under one word. And then you can decline it in different manners, it's openness, right? That is probably the word that every panel members has repeated and has committed to from a national perspective, from an EU perspective, and from the EU perspective, from the Commission perspective, from the different angles. And not only, I would say, openness, there's also been, I think, a commitment from all the participants to the fact that, yes, there are different policies, but all of those policies contribute in a harmonious manner to this overarching vision. So I think that is definitely nice. And if I were to bring indeed a historical perspective, I mean, after all, this discussion we have today, and I think you, Renilde, put it very well at the start with your slides. I mean, we're in a different world today than the world from, let's say, 30 years ago, and I'm talking of 30 years ago because this is about when the single market was launched, and the single market was also one of the terms that everybody feels not only committed to and to improve, but also, as Gert-Jan said, I think we all see that this is a key asset in our economic well-being in Europe. So that commitment to the single market and what the single market can deliver is an old standing one. And it's true that I think if one looks, let's say 30 years ago, 20 years ago, they would have probably been a bit less agreement, both on the side of countries. And also, I think one would have seen, well, you know, yes, there are the three policies, but maybe the three policies are not always pulling in the same direction. And I think indeed one has made progress on that. So I think, you know, this is all the well, and as you say, you know, is the issue simply to continue in this new gained, let's say, consensus around openness and the tools, the different tools contributing to that. And I would add, to be fair, I would add indeed the word fairness, because, you know, as most of the speakers said, well, you know, it's openness, but it's not a naive openness, and whether you call it fairness, you call level playing field, again, that is a term that all five interventions use. So it's openness, but it's openness, not a naive openness. Let's call it in that way. And again, I think there was consensus on all players. So let me add something to this. And I agree with what is, you know, that there is this consensus. And it's not just, I don't think it was just words. Yes, indeed, I think I do detect that consensus in action, you know, in the policy levers that are being used, the countries that are represented around the table as well. And, you know, I don't have any claim that, no, look, this is all hypocritical and, you know, behind this nice facade, things are less bright. Now, let me then go back a little bit to the start. And what is the problem here? Is there no problem? I mean, yes, market shares, we are fine. China, yes, China is growing very, very rapidly. We saw that again in your slides. But this is great. This is that's to be expected. After all, China is integrated in the global economy. It's not just a competitor. It's also a huge market, huge opportunities, consumers. I mean, all of those kind of things. So. Is there no problem? Or if there's no problem, you know, what is the discussion about? So I think Thomas made, I think, a very important point. It seems to me, and I want to push a little bit in this direction. He said, well, again, the Commission and everybody around the table agrees on the slogan, and which is not just a slogan, that's what we practice, is protection without protectionism. Okay, but then the question is protection of whom? Okay, and Thomas said, well, the discussion has been, on this panel, has been focusing mostly on firms. And, but it's not only about firms, right? It's also about workers. It's also about consumers, let's say citizens. There's also politics here, Paolo raised. It's also about our values. So maybe that's an entry point here to try to look at, you know, what are the problems that we need to tackle. And I will say something on this. And the second thing that I want to say, all this within my 7 minutes, I know that I've used already a few minutes. The second issue I want to discuss a little bit is question of sectors versus technology. No, so let me make those two points. I think that indeed, I think we have to be mindful, and I think maybe that's Paolo's last point when he talked about politics. We have to be mindful, I think, first of really identifying what are the issues from an EU perspective. Okay, from an EU perspective, the EU in the global world and in an open global world, what are the issues that our policies need to tackle? There's some issues indeed of, let's call them, about the firms, about competitiveness. And that's the relationship with the sectors and the technologies. That's one issue. I think there are some issues, okay? Not everything is bright. The second issue is that it could even be that even though there is competitiveness, on the part of the supply side of the economy, on the part of firms, and that we see that firms, sectors, you know, are doing fairly well. However you look at it, market share, you know, any indicators that you may want to use. Nonetheless, citizens, be they consumers or be they workers, they feel ill at ease in this world of rapid change. So yes, maybe firms are able to take advantages of those changes. Maybe we are able to create the right environment in terms of policy, and that firms see, you know, that there are indeed opportunities. And yes, there's also even level playing field. So firms, you know, are satisfied that, in a sense, the policy response to their needs are being done, but the workers in those firms maybe are less happy, and workers are citizens, are voters, and you know, citizens are also consumers, and consumers, I think they generally like this more global world, and the greater competition, and greater competition gives lower prices, greater choice for consumers, but the citizens are not only consumers, they're also workers. And yes, I think there is an issue. And again, I would agree very much with Thomas when you said, you know, we need to look at other policies. And if other policies are not right, then it's difficult for instance, trade policy or other policies to fulfill. The tools that we have, let's say, at the EU level, they can only fulfill the need of citizens of our society at large if those other policies are working. So I would very much go in the direction of saying we need to look at protection is not just from firms, from a broader perspective, and see to what extent indeed including workers feel that we have the right tools, knowing that most of those tools obviously at the national level. So I think that's one lesson, that it's not just a question of EU policies, be they competition, trade, or industrial policy. It's also how those policies work together with the national policies. And that's always obviously the challenge in the EU. It's an EU system, and the EU system is partly EU policies, partly national policies, and if one side does not work well, there's really tension in the system. So I think that's point number one. Point number two, about the sectors and the technologies. In the sense, in the figures that you showed, Renilde, you gave data on sectors, in a sense. The high-tech sectors, the medium-term, the medium-high technology. And we saw that, indeed, European firms, the European economy at the sectoral level is not doing badly. The more worry that you expressed, and I think that I heard from others, is about the digital economy, the digital transformation, the AI, sort of as technologies. So I would say something positive and negative. I would say that look, it's clear that Europe is lagging. And has been long lagging behind the US. Now there is, we are also starting to lag behind China in some of those digital technology and AI technologies, and so those are real issues. So in the sense, we have a bigger challenge even than we used to have. Again, when we launched the single market and thinking, we had always in mind the US, right? That was, the American challenge, right? That was a bit sort of the starting point. There was a bit of Korea, there was a bit of Singapore that has been mentioned, but okay, they were nothing compared to the big elephant, as you described, China, and then the other, Brazil, India, other players. So I would say that in terms of technology, so there's plus and minus. We still have strength in a number of manufacturing sectors. And those manufacturing sectors, they've been able to incorporate the new technologies. So the digital economy is not absent from the rest of the economy. And if you look at those sectors where Europe has strength, including in automobile, you know, some were saying on the panel that yeah, we are behind into some of the car sectors with the, you know, the new technologies, the AI. I'm not that sure. I'm not that sure. When I see Uber, what, you know, the order that Uber made was about Volvo cars. So, you know, we're still able to produce some of those cars. We are able to incorporate in those cars the new technology. So I think we are not doing that badly. Where we are not doing well is, in a sense, in the services part of this and in the initiation of some of this technology. So we are still able, where we are on the frontier in the manufacturing sector, this manufacturing industry is able to incorporate the technology, whether it's in electrical equipment, whether it's in chemicals, whether it's in the car industries. I think we are still on the edge. I think indeed in the development of technologies, and then there was the mention, for instance, of the capital markets notion, the financing of innovation and of innovators and of growing. I mean, you, Renil, have done a lot of work, you know, about, you know, ability of European firms to scale up. Now, that has been clearly quite an issue. It's probably not much of an issue that deals with competition. It's probably not much dealing with trade, not much with industrial policy. It's in other areas, including the financing. So, I mean, to conclude, I would say that indeed we need to broaden our discussion. First, identify clearly what are the problems. And I would say there are problems, and certainly there is backlash, there's political backlash. And there is political backlash, not just in Europe, right? There's a political backlash in the US, there's backlash in the UK. There is sort of this demand for certain policies that tend to be protectionist. So this demand for protection that is protectionist. Okay, because there are those in the society that do feel that those changes are making them as losers. And so therefore there is real demand. And even if firms are doing well, not all segments of the citizens are doing well. And I think in particular to workers, to citizens at large that don't have always this positive view. And then I think that indeed the issues of technologies. So even those or sectors, I don't detect much problems at the sectoral level, but I detect problems in some key technologies that could at some stage jeopardize some of our strengths at the sectoral level.
Yep. Thank you very much, André, for broadening the discussion and challenging a bit the consensus on the table here. I'd like, before we turn to the audience for questions and answers, I'd like to give the panel one short opportunity to react to each other here and to André's comments, and perhaps add or further specify what André also mentioned, to broaden a bit the discussion in terms of, first of all, beyond firms, also how should we protect citizens and workers to deal more with the political issues here. But I'd also like to come back to when we're saying protecting EU firms, which firms are we actually talking about here? And bringing also, again, the whole notion of the innovation game back on the table here, because I think that's really where the biggest challenge will be for future here. Is also how in the innovation game other countries, and particularly China, is rising so fast, and where actually the EU has traditionally been not so strong in terms of its innovation power, particularly because its innovation was much more concentrated on incumbent firms, incumbent sectors, being good in these sectors, in incrementally improving, adopting technologies here, but not really strong enough to be disrupting, to be in the new areas, and that's the technology dimension that you were raising here. And partly this is also, I think, because our instruments like industrial policy or also like trade policy and competition policy perhaps have ignored a little bit this innovation dimension and this disruption and new players here, and concentrated a bit too much on buffering, on protecting our existing firms here, on stakeholders consultation of existing industry to help to identify particular areas here, rather than actually being sufficiently open for these new disruptors here. You also already mentioned, is our capital market sufficiently open for the disruptors rather than for the existing here? So that's why I would like to have a short panel round again to react more to these new players, innovation, and how do we see that we can actually have the instruments in place and our policy instruments enough to deal with those more challenging, disruptive innovators. Foko, you first.
Yeah, thank you. I'm pleased to take up your question and also take up a point made by Vincent on the setup of standards. I think one of the things that we should look into when we look into, for example, digitization and the digitization of the economy is what can we do as a government to facilitate the development. One of the things is that we do not have a true internal market, which is for scaling up a problem. So there we could really improve, also at the European level, to foster more of a digital internal market. And that doesn't always mean that we have to facilitate or to create new regulatory frameworks, but we should really try and see where we can facilitate data exchange, where we can facilitate common standards to be used. These type of things can help to foster a business environment and let the creativity of the businesses work. Sometimes it helps to have a regulatory framework at the European level. To take the example of the GDPR, I think that sets a European standard in a digital world, which is very helpful and also is a really challenging new model to the standards being used elsewhere in the world, and which can also help the businesses to develop a true new European model. So I think there's a lot to be done there at the European level in terms of setting up of standards. And to take one other example, perhaps a little bit more of an old industry nature, but to take decarbonization as an example, there we also need standards and also European standards. Otherwise, the industry would just walk away. We are currently working in the Netherlands on a climate accord, as we call it, a climate agreement, and also talking to the industry to decarbonize. Well, one of the challenges we face is that if we are too strict in the Netherlands on decarbonization, there are alternative places where industry can work. So we do also here need a European level and to set standards in which our businesses can work, prosper, but also are protective in this example towards climate and climate change, and also protective towards citizens in a more broader sense, and only protecting the entrepreneurs or the enterprises. So that will be a short answer to your question.
Definitely this whole regulatory agenda, setting standards here at the EU level, but also how they can be then integrated within multilateral settings as well. Yeah. Vincent?
Thank you. Well, I will not repeat what I just said, like the importance of the single market, of standardization, just and of course the question of financing. This is absolutely key. We have huge amount of savings in Europe, and that's a key asset. Unfortunately, these savings are not financing enough innovation and long-term investment. And that is not for public money to sort of replace these private funds, because they are much bigger than what the public fund could do. But we need to have some right incentives for these savings, the long-term savings, pension funds, life insurance, to invest only a very small proportion, but which would represent actually the big difference that we have now between Europe and the US. In France, we are around, as I said, per GDP ratio, quarter the size of what the US invests, and of course the size of the economy is much smaller. To get to, it's around 2 billion per year. To reach the 8 billion, which will be the amount, the US, actually, it is only a very small amount of the overall savings that we have in our economy. And that's the same for the rest of the European economy. But let me say a word about trade policy, because I would not like to be misunderstood. I'm not saying trade policy is not important. To protect EU companies, what I said is it's first foremost the internal policies that are very important. But of course, to get the right trade policy, it's absolutely crucial in this very uncertain world. And actually, trade policy is one of the key successes of Europe, like the competition policy. There's no chance. I mean, it's not probably there's probably a link with the fact that it's the most two most integrated policy at the European level, and we should draw some lesson for in some other areas where we're doing less well, actually. And there are scope for trade policy to do a lot, actually, to foster. First, I mean, Europe as one of the largest markets, if not the largest market in the world, is actually now an anchor of stability in this very uncertain world, with our old ally actually going into very dangerous directions. And of course, we have problems with China, but like with other partners, it's always true. They also have problems with us, and that's normal. Of course, we haven't updated WTO rules, only very little, since the end of the 90s. That's why, of course, the WTO rules are not fit to deal with the new issues that we see arising. Of course, we try to do, but I mean, in the current context, it's very difficult. And we know that the last round of negotiation where we wanted to update the WTO rules just failed. So what else? Actually, why not going back? If we have problems, for example, with China, and we do have problems, why not going back to old tools like trade agreements, actually, where we would ask them to deal with issues, including state aids policy, in exchange for us solving some of their problems on the EU market. And actually, that's the old way, but that could work. And of course, I know that will raise competition issues in terms of, I mean, some industries. But if we are serious about being an open and sort of a fair, developing an open and fair trading system, that's also a way forward. And why not actually, in this current context of a very uncertain trade system, offering to all the willing countries sort of a plurilateral agreement where we would define the trade tools of tomorrow, in terms of dispute settlements, in terms of updating regularly the rules, in terms of probably not resulting on unanimity for each change of rule. And at some point, because many countries now feeling basically the risk of the US market to be closer in the next few years, and the risk of a sort of a trade war, would probably like to enter in some sort of a plurilateral agreement, ambitious, that would set basically the trading rules in a wide way, including some commitments in terms of climate change, being part of the Paris Agreement, in terms of probably tax policy, other elements that should be in some sort of agreements that way, brought back into the WTO when basically enough countries would have joined that plurilateral agreement, and when at WTO actually would be in a position to update its rule.
That's another big issue here is, rather than multilateralism, think more creatively about bilateralism or coalition of the willing here. So that's definitely also an important issue to discuss. So I want to give the floor also to my left side here. So particularly, do you think your policy instruments have been sufficiently strong also to address more, you know, the new sectors, the new firms here? Or, sorry.
Yes, maybe very quickly, because it would be interesting to have a debate as well with the floor. But very quickly, a couple of points. I think, you know, the emphasis that André and also Thomas put on the social dimension and, you know, whom are we actually protecting is very fundamental, because obviously in a world that comes out of the Great Recession, where we know that in many countries around the world, you know, the income distribution has taken a bit of a hit. Even in Europe, with its strong welfare systems, the evidence is that the bottom 20% have been hit hard. There have been big regional disparities. It is obvious that this is washed up in a call for protectionism. So this then leads to a question of coordination, because many of the policies that are relevant are policies under the control of member states. And I think this is a question which we can no longer escape, needs to be given significant prominence, is being dealt with in the context of the European semester to some extent, is part of the debate about economic governance, and the Commission has advocated yesterday again a significant increase in the funding for structural reform support. So I think if we zoom out, this is probably the one issue that we need to look at, where we should also, in the Union, find a way of holding each other to account, because failing progress on this front, we will have debates that are misguided. On standards, let me just say that I wholeheartedly agree that often European standards are actually a tool of competitiveness, and rather paradoxically, my experience over many, many years has been that some industry associations who fought tooth and nail against tough European standards were later the biggest beneficiaries further down the road. What are the car standards in China? They're inspired on European standards. Even REACH, I would say, I hope there's no one here from the Chemical Industry Association, but even REACH has helped. Will GDPR play the same role in the future? Is this actually a tool of competitiveness simply by virtue of the size of our economies and the vibrancy of our model? We should not shy away from it. And finally, I think in terms of capital market union and the importance this plays for innovation, for your questions, this is fundamental. It's absolutely fundamental. You know, our banking sector today is more consolidated behind national borders than it was 10 years ago. So the huge savings disparities at the macroeconomic level in Europe are actually not pooled across the Union in a way that could even finance a lot of this innovation, leave alone the conservatism that, of course, banks would naturally have, where venture capital should play a bigger role. So again, this is a fundamental piece of the puzzle, where to some extent a lot of the state aid that we approve is a substitute for failing private finance. And this is also why our rules in this area are actually very generous, because there is an obvious problem in this respect.
Yep. Thank you.
Well, also very, very briefly, because I really sort of want to hear some different views perhaps than the consensus view, which I will perhaps challenge just a little bit, because I don't want to leave here with the idea that all is fine and that our toolbox is sort of in perfectly good order. I mean, I think I did try to submit that I think we are clear in our diagnosis, but not necessarily in the remedies. I mean, we know we need some remedies, but how to get there and what exactly we need in getting things done is, I think, the challenge that is still ahead of us. And picking up on some of the points that Vincent made, we are, of course, already very much trying to upgrade the rule book in the WTO as mentioned, but also with the Chinese bilaterally through the comprehensive agreement on investment, which is more than just a bilateral investment treaty dealing with investment, but looks at some of these broader questions, including the matter of state-owned enterprises and the role thereof. We've been working very much with the Chinese, for example, on sovereign wealth funds and on through the IMF on the Santiago principles on how sort of particular ownership structures raise concerns of accountability and transparency, and that we need to do more on that. So I think the challenge is pretty clear, but addressing that and solving that is really still outstanding. So I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, and I'm sure some in the audience will challenge us even further.
Yeah, being always the last, I think I have the privilege of getting probably the geeky comments to make, which is in a way probably what I'm feeling comfortable with. So that's not so bad. I would like to take up on first one point made by Andre on the point of sector versus technology. I totally agree with what he says. So most of the industrial policy at the EU level now is based on technology or policy areas rather than sector. And the reason, of course, is that technologies now, at least the groundbreaking technologies, are totally horizontal, like digital technologies. So talking about sectors probably makes no sense at all at the moment. Another example is the circular economy. It's also a completely cross-sectoral policy. So on that, I totally agree. The challenge of that is not only at the coordination level, but also for economists, how to measure the progress on these particular things. And that's why I also agree with what you said about digitalization. Although it would be very naive not to recognize that the EU is lagging behind in some respect. I think we should not start crying about how bad we are, because measuring what is going on in terms of digitalization is at the moment very difficult. The current indicator that we're using tend to overestimate the positive impact for the US of firms like Google, Facebook, and the like, and quite underestimate the effects that they are having on the European firms. So we have to be very careful when judging how bad we are doing with respect to the US. Last point, also related on who are we protecting and how. This is, of course, a very difficult question to answer to. I think the point here is that on top of taking care of the losers and protecting the losers, be them the firms whose business is being disrupted or the workers that are being fired, etc. We might also want to have a look at the winners. So the so-called winners of globalization, and have a look at what they have done. And for instance, the big winner of the globalization is considered Asia, China, and the like. And we have to recognize that they played a different game compared to ours. And that's something that we have to look at with a lot of care, with a lot of attention. And that goes back to the reciprocity issue. And so it's a word of caution also for economists in this respect.
Okay. So indeed, a bit more cautiousness than just a consensus that we might have created. Okay, now it's definitely time for the audience for questions. Ooh, yeah, okay. Do we have a microphone or? Yeah, but when you start, can you just say who you are?
My name is Oliver Kim. I'm the correspondent here for the Austrian newspaper Die Presse. Yeah. Just a short question on China. Why do you assume that China is interested in the Chinese rulers are interested in a level playing field? There is no rule of law in China. Legal redress there is only granted to its own citizens to the extent that it doesn't interfere with the interests of powerful cadres of the Chinese Communist Party. It has an increasingly imperialistic outlook both on its immediate neighborhood but also on the world, and this whole feeling that we read about that China is only coming back to its rightful place in history. So why should they be interested in a common rule book, same rules for everyone and so forth? Thank you.
Okay, so we were expecting more critical questions from the public. Yep.
Yes, good morning. My name is Hans van der Borchert from Politico. A question to Mr. Koopman. A lot was raised in the very beginning by Mr. Feiseler, for example, on the issue of reciprocity. how much actually do you think when it comes to the whole instrument of investment screening, better looking at investment, also maybe the question of shell companies, I'd say, for example, Chinese investor buying a company in Portugal and this company taking over a company in Germany, for example, we should actually use more the strong competition watchdog muscle that we have in the EU to implement it in this policy and really crack down on these practices. And maybe there was a question raised by your colleague Mr. Baird on the risk of Brexit, basically the UK freewheeling as a Singapore challenge there. How much do you also think we should use the anti-competition muscle in a Brexit deal? How much should it be actually involved to avoid those things from happening? Thank you.
Bianca Stella De Angelis from Herring Schopenhauer. I would have a question to Mr. Bert, and then also comments would be welcome from the national side on the very pragmatic case that we have at the moment with the trade tensions with the US. So where do you see the potential scenario going in terms of the extension that have been granted to the EU, where we see very practically the dilemma on the one side of dealing with the US and needing to strike a balance between not escalating but also be firm, and at the same time you start seeing different positionings if you just look at France and Germany on the one side, and also the question I ask myself, how far can you go without potentially irritating also the Chinese side that at the same time is the one that is being targeted also by the bilateral activities that are going on. And just two brief comments on the political element of this economic observations. I think it will be very interesting also in view of the European election next year and the next Commission taking up the term to see what messages are very clearly and pragmatically conveyed, so that it's actually understood that the European framework is not only relevant, but something is happening in terms of innovation, but also fostering a fair and free and not naive trade competition policy or whatever. And I think it's quite tricky there. And the second, on the foreign direct investment screening, I just attended a few weeks ago a discussion on that matter, where the DG Trade was very clear in saying, well, this is not about reciprocity, it's not about trade, it's about investment, which is interesting to see how it ties into this debate, where there is a clear consensus that innovation, competition and trade policy should be integrated. So sorry for the long intervention.
Kurt Geisert from Backbone Consulting in Germany. Also a question for Mr. Koopman. You mentioned the start of negotiations, the dialogue with China. We all remember the KUKA case, acquisition by Chinese investors of KUKA Robotics in Augsburg in Germany. Do you think that this case has given a wake-up call? Do you think a second case like this will be possible? Thank you.
Jan Michalek, University of Warsaw, Poland. Two more general or maybe a bit naive questions. I'm so happy that everyone is consensus about the openness, but I have the impression that somehow the major challenge facing EU right now is what options should be in terms of trade policy, whether it should be towards multilateralism or bilateralism, if I may say so. And in this context, one of the key issues which would be interesting to know, what shall EU be engaged heavily in protecting existing WTO rules? What is the meaning of Article 2 of schedules of commitment? What is the meaning of the dispute settlement body? What is the meaning of anti-dumping procedures and so on? These are, in my view, quite important issues from the longer perspective which are faced by the Commission. And this second minor comment, it's good to have a clear, it would be nice to have a clear common policy, but we also are missing the common knowledge about the behavior of companies. In fact, there was a project financed also by Bruegel, Fige, which has ended. And by now, we don't have precise information on the behavior of companies. Being universal, covering all the countries, we don't know much about what is happening in terms of digitalization, of the implementation of innovation, and so on. So it's, in my view, quite difficult to give a very precise prescription without having quite a good knowledge about the common position of companies in Europe. For the moment, we have only the common databases is BEEPS, which is elaborated by European, the ECB, but it covers only some countries from the Central Europe, and it's very limited in terms of number of companies and number of information. So perhaps here would be also some, if I may say so, role for the Commission in order to promote this sort of research, survey-based, and having broader knowledge about the behavior of companies. Sorry for being slightly longer.
Hi, my name is Alan Beattie. I write for the Financial Times. I have a question about data. I've not spoken to anyone from the tech industry, or indeed any industry, who thinks that the EU's approach to data flows, even its new model data flows chapter, is going to seriously constrain any trading partners' plans on data localization and so forth. And indeed, the EU's approach to this seems to be unilateral and about exporting GDPR through ad hoc adequacy arrangements. How far do people think the EU is absenting itself from the global debate on the governance of data flow?
Sorry, just very briefly, Stefan Rees from the Dutch Parliament. I mean, it's great to have a panel with so much consensus. I think that the consensus comes partly because you have quite a large thing on your plate up there. And if I hear the variety of questions that you get, indeed, there's all different kind of angles there. For me, the compelling issue that we talk about is that we are, of course, in a global economy, but there is a number of players there who don't play by the rules, who don't perform the market behavior that we would expect to take place there. And that behavior risks to affect firms in the European Union and their innovative and competitive potential. Whereas we see that happening in a context which neither multilaterally or in the bilateral dialogue we currently have enough speed and urgency and tease even to address that. That for me is the crucial puzzle. So I simply, in answering these questions that you've been posed, would want to challenge you to become more concrete. What are we going to do with that? I mean, fantastic that we've dealt with aviation within the EU, just to give a concrete example. But I remember a Dutch-French company which is still looking at state aid outside the EU in aviation and sees big bottlenecks there. I mean, how are we going to address these existing issues given that the system in which we operate possibly doesn't deliver as fast and as thoroughly as it should?
Hi, I'm Brett Heck from BBVA, and I'd like to take up an issue Andre touched from the digital economy, and there in particular the platform economy, which has its own very strong winner-takes-all dynamics. And how could, and there's a question to all three of the politicians, or of the policy sides, what can we do to tackle those digital platforms, which unfortunately come rather from outside the EU, the big ones at least, the winners for the moment. And well, what is DG Comp doing to tackle those? Could there be an industrial policy to foster European platforms? And touching maybe the data topic we had before what are we doing from the trade side to include data flows, etc., in trade agreements?
So, as we expected, we get a lot of tough questions from the floor to test our consensus. So let's see if we can deal with this. So, big question here was China, but perhaps even beyond China. Are we really in a level playing field? Players really stick by the rules or not? And if not, how do we deal with it? I think, Thomas, that's a question that goes for you. The effect of Brexit also is a question for you. The trade tensions with the US, how that all fits within multilateral, or should we go more for bilateral and even within bilateral? I guess, André, that's also an issue for you to deal with. There was also a question on data and freedom of data flows within. I guess that you mentioned that also briefly, so maybe you... There were lots of questions for you too in terms of reciprocity, how we do that in the investment screening, how for vital sectors, how can we affect third countries, and for digital platforms, how can we control the fact that most of the leaders here are from the outside? Are instruments sufficiently for that? Are competition policy instruments? So lots of questions for this side, but you will have some. Okay. So, Thomas, you want to start?
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Why is China interested in negotiating or in leveling the playing field? Well, China is interested in the field. And so to get access to the field, you need to have the free part to it, you need the fair part to it. And that is our essential proposition. Now, if your question or the underlying premise is one of what is our leverage, I mean, of course, that's a good point. And some might be attracted to reciprocity type of ideas, to close something first before opening it away. I mean, I think Mr. Trump is essentially engaging in imposing what some would call leverage tariffs. He creates his own leverage out of well, obscure old trade laws. And so that is I think that is the essential proposition that we're doing. And so there's many ways to go about that. What is very clear these days is that we share a strong systemic interest with China in the system, and perhaps we're not finding ourselves there on the same page with the United States, in that the global rules-based trading system hugely benefits China. It benefits the small and vulnerable ones. It benefits the European Union too. And so to uphold that system, that rules-based system, including dispute settlement mechanism and the appellate body in particular, is indeed critical. And so that is what we're looking for from the Chinese. And the Chinese, I think they see that systemic interest. I mean, we all keep going back to President Xi Jinping's comments in Davos. We obviously need to see that, to see them walking that talk, and we are trying to achieve that indeed in what I mentioned, the negotiations towards a comprehensive agreement on investment, as well as the rules that we're trying to upgrade in the context of the WTO together with the Chinese. So the leverage question is, of course, a very legitimate one, but I think China is certainly interested in leveling that playing field as much as it wants to kind of use that field to its advantage. On the question of the United States, I guess there was a sort of more general question on what does the future look like. I can't really look into the future, of course, but I can only say and recall what others at a higher pay grade have done before me, which is that we are engaged in conversations with the United States towards a permanent extension from tariffs on steel and aluminium pursuant to U.S. measures under Section 232. That is a conversation which is ongoing. We've taken note of the fact that there will be a temporary exemption. We are not negotiating with a gun to our head, so we're not talking about any other issues or concerns that the US side may have on the EU or on our internal market or on our trade policy for as long as we do not see a permanent extension. But we are, of course, always open to talk about such other things as we were in a negotiation known as TTIP or previously in conversations taking place under the so-called Transatlantic Economic Council. So I think you sort of hinted at already yourself, this is walking a fine balance between not escalating things, but being firm and not being naive. I think that is indeed a very, very good illustration of the broader policy line which we tried to submit just now. I think the question maybe Gert-Jan also wants to comment a little on FDI screening. I'm not sure what exactly the gist of the question was, but just to confirm that this is not about reciprocity. Indeed, this is about dealing with a very specific and legitimate policy concern. So investments that challenge our security, our national security, and that of member states, by, for example, acquiring essential assets be it critical infrastructure, technology, or certain inputs. So I can only confirm what I think you reported, which is that this is not a reciprocity type of idea. This goes back to the very notion that you need fair rules to have a free and an open trading or investment regime. And I don't see a difference there between investment or trade policy, even if the rules are perhaps slightly different and the instruments are. Now, on the policy, and I think the question, what do we do multilaterally and what do we do bilaterally, and maybe the sort of underlying idea is whether or not there's a contradiction between both, or whether we should not go one way or the other way. I think our view is quite clear. There's certainly no contradiction there. We are staunch multilateralists, being a product of regulated economic integration ourselves. So we're firm believers of the WTO and the rules-based global trading system. We're working relentlessly to protect the system, to preserve the system, just as we were trying to keep also the negotiating function of the WTO alive. We're trying to keep the entire organization, of course, very much alive, and we are looking at the Chinese and many others to help us in that regard. But engaging bilaterally is no contradiction to that policy, and I'm a huge fan of Bob Zoellick's doctrine of competitive liberalization, the fact that you pursue your policy on different avenues, be it multilateral, bilateral, and unilateral, and at the end of the day, they all sort of inspire one another. One step breeds another step elsewhere, and hopefully the businessman that US President Trump will at some point realize that he is in a competitive game that he needs to engage in positively, as opposed to abrogating trade agreements or retreating from the system. The second half of the first term of a US president is always the better timing for positive initiatives. So let's hope. I'm clearly a glass is half full person. And then on the data flow side, no, I mean, Alan, I don't know whether you spoke to Mr. Zuckerberg, who seems to think that the GDPR was or could be a global standard, and so that there could be a Brussels effect on data flows. Let's see. I can only observe what is being said and what others here on the panel have said before me, that the GDPR might or could be perhaps one of those standards like REACH, and I very much agree with that, or CARS, a standard that others will indeed follow. I mean, that said, we are, and that was essentially the point that I was trying to make when I say that a good trade policy starts at home. We need a good product to sell. We are leveraging our internal market essentially to trade policy. So I want my colleagues to keep the knife very sharp there, and to make sure that we have good things to sell and leverage indeed to go abroad and seek openness abroad. So in that context, indeed, we need to get it right in terms of the movement of data and data flows inside the European Union. A lot of work is ongoing for us to be able, of course, to project that same high standard abroad. And that is also, of course, as you know, a discussion which is ongoing in the Council and soon also with the European Parliament.
No, maybe very briefly on the reciprocity point. I think Thomas has already spoken about what the objective of investment screening is. So this is not about reciprocity. It's not a competition tool. It's actually a very different instrument. We need to be clear about this. So the question is what other concerns, should be addressed, and whether we have the tools to address them. That's, I think, a more relevant way of looking at this. Now, on the trade side, there is the anti-dumping framework. There's the countervailing duties. So that's one bit. And then internally, competition policy actually has a number of features that allow us to address concerns that people have. If we look at regional support, a very frequent scenario is one where companies say, listen, we need to build a new plant. We are considering locating it in, say, Hungary, but we have an offer from China or from Mexico. And the government is helping building the infrastructure and helping us with seed finance. So our rules already today, and it's not well known, allow us to take this into account. So obviously it would be wrong for us to prohibit a state aid in Poland if this meant that the investment would simply go to Mexico on the back of state aid, just to give you an example. So this already exists. We have similar provisions in our rules for state aid in the field of innovation, the so-called matching clause. Now, what is very interesting So let me explain this. So basically, if a member state can demonstrate that it needs to give this state aid because there is state aid being given to a competitor in a third country, then we can take this into account and the aid intensities would be higher. However, this has never been invoked. And this is a puzzle. So we have this big debate, this concern about reciprocity. This is apparently a very big problem. But there hasn't been a single instance of this being put on the table of the Commission, whereas, I get sick and tired of advocating these rules because they're there. Now, people say maybe it's too complex, maybe, they fear retaliation. But, it is a little bit surprising that there is, on the one hand, this enormous concern, and on the other hand, there is little empirical evidence. Which brings me to my final point. I think we have a system. It's not perfect. The world is not perfect. I'm coming back to what Stefan Ras was saying. You have actors there who are trying to operate in the grey zone, if we want to be very polite to them. Do our tools allow us to address this? Or should we go for a revision of our toolkit? That is the underlying question. I think we need to be careful to jump to the conclusion that our toolkit is insufficient. Because our toolkit, as we have just explained, and this is a little bit the consensus on the panel, has delivered, a lot of economic welfare. So we're not closed intellectually, policy-wise, to looking at evidence. But the problem in this area is that the evidence is often missing. So what do? You try to collect the evidence. We've actually set up a group together with the colleagues from DG Trade, as a joint trade DG Comp group with member states, where we've asked them specifically to provide us with more hard data in confidence. Obviously, we have very strict confidentiality between the two DGs, so we're asking member states to do this. And obviously, if we get this information, we'll do something with it. But we need to be very careful to work on the basis of general presumptions and to draw inferences from that in policy terms that may turn out to be extremely costly.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing, I think which has maybe not yet been raised in the discussion, which seems to me very relevant, which is global value chains. I think we see in the trade, but trade competition and industrial policy, I think that was the starting point of the discussion. Is the global and the globalized world. And globalized world means that, it's not clear who are all firms. In Europe, there are lots of firms that are headquartered in other places, in other parts of the world that are operating in Europe. There are lots of European firms, European headquartered firms that are operating in other parts of the world. And we are all mutually interdependent. And I'm very struck, just to take one example, when you look at the steel measures, the 232 steel measures. There's a very interesting process, in the US. There's rule of law in the US, certainly. Firms have been invited by the Commerce Department to put forward requests to have their products being exempted, the products that they're importing, to be exempted from the 25% tariff measures for steel or the 10% measures on aluminum, on the basis of, maybe those products are not available in the US. It would create all kinds of difficulties, including for employment in the US. There's been thousands of petitions to that. And so it's not just that, Europe is asking to be exempted. It's also the fact that US-based firms, some of which are not US headquartered firms, they could be European headquartered firms. They could be, firms that are headquartered anywhere. But they're operating in the US and are creating employment in the US. Well, they are needing to import some of the steel in order to be able to continue. And so the pressure, in a sense, on the Trump administration is not just coming from countries, that are saying that, what is going on here, and, the multilateral system, and, friendship, and, all of those kind of things. It's also coming from operators that are saying those measures make absolutely no sense in today's world. So I think we have always to keep in mind that whether we are in Europe, it's you know, European firms, they operate globally, and they operate globally through trade, to foreign direct investment, through all kinds of measures. And whatever we do affects us, or what others do affects us in a very complicated, very complicated manner. The US takes measures against China. Those measures affect also European firms, whether they are European firms operating in China or European firms operating in the US. And you know, it's a very complex sort of set of relationship through those global value chains.
Yeah, thanks very much. We're running a bit out of time, so I need to close the panel here, but I want to give the floor still for one last minute to the three people who haven't been able to reply. No.
Just maybe very quickly a final word, saying that indeed digital economy data absolutely key, and maybe maybe that's for another roundtable, but maybe we may want to ask ourselves if ex post competition policy is enough to deal with the regulation of this very important sector. And if we may want to consider having a regulator for that sector. But that's opening another debate. That's probably for another day.
Yeah, that's a good conclusion. Paolo, you are you fine? Yeah, okay. So then I want to close the panel here. As promised, I think it was a very interesting discussion here. I think in general, our panel really was able to manage the consensus, even despite the very tough questions here. Consensus of the importance of openness, both free and fair trade dimensions here. I think we have a vision, we have a strategy, we have the toolkit, and also the wisdom to implement this. But I think a very important point is that indeed what we are missing is the evidence of, does it really work? Does it pay off? And does it generate the benefits that we need in order to sell this, also to deal with the political discussion here? Benefits for whom? From the existing firms, for the new firms, for the workers, for the consumers here. And that's why I think a very important part for the agenda is also to start to collect that evidence, to monitor the effects here and the benefits, because that will be very important to deal with, to extend our consensus as economists also on the political level here. So thanks for your attention and support here. Also, I want to say that at Bruegel, this kind of topic is something that's constantly on our agenda here, so we regularly have publications on that. We will also, on the website of this event, we'll also link a few of these publications as well, but do keep trace of what we are doing on this, also with future events. Thanks a lot for coming so early and for joining the discussion, and thanks for the panel members for this very interesting and stimulating discussion. Thanks.